Hi there, welcome to PDM Vlogs, and today we're talking about LUFS. That's loudness units full scale. So what is it and why is it important? Well, it's a measurement of loudness that's been recently developed and adopted by most of the industry. And is starting to gain prevalence in streaming services. So we have started to look at how we mix and master in reference to those standards. So this is a little bit about the history of how these measurements developed and also how we approach mixing and mastering to fit within the new kind of limits. So mastering at the moment, especially for streaming, is a fairly complex process. There's lots of different opinions about how to do it and what to focus on, but it came about mainly because of something called the loudness wars, which was something that happened from the early 80s when CDs came in, where engineers and producers started to push levels and make their tracks louder. Now we've got a little example here to show you what I mean. So here's a track called Celestial Reflections, which I've been recently working on. I haven't released it yet, but this is an early mix. And on this we had the limiter set to a threshold of about -5 or 6. So, not stupidly high. Basically what you can see here is that there's a reasonable amount of dynamic range, but you can see at the tops here, along the top, that a lot of the peaks have been kind of sliced off, chopped off. So it should look like that, and it's been so it looks flat. And that's the limiter kicking in. So it's been basically pushed against the limiter. Why is this a bad thing? Well, in effect, you're losing a bit of information, for starters. So here, I think the limit was set, at -0.3 dB. And although you might set it at -0.3, that doesn't mean you can get some peaks sneaking through, as we'll see later. It's not necessarily a bad thing in itself, but when you listen to how it sounds, that when it starts to become obvious. Now, this isn't a particularly bad example, because you can see plenty of examples of stuff that's been maxed out on using a limiter, and the entire waveform is just one solid block, and that's how things were developing basically. So we redid this using LUFS as a kind of measure, as a kind of guide, and the waveform looked more like this. So you've got, again, peaks that are being caught by a limiter, but there's much fewer of them, and that's tends to be less noticeable. And the harder you push it against the limiter, the more you get distortion. So when we listened back to this particular example, the sound was quite brash, quite brittle. There's quite a lot of distortion coming in at some of those peaks, which are mainly caused by the bass drum overloading, and it was quite fatiguing to listen to. And although it sounded louder and more in your face, it didn't sound as nice. So this version here, again, it sounded a bit quieter, but then you can turn it up. And when you do turn it up, it doesn't kind of disintegrate, and it doesn't kind of fatigue the edge. It maintains its kind of cohesion and clarity, and sounds quite sweet. So we started looking at how we approach mastering, and to go for more this kind of dynamic route rather than the kind of pushing it into the limiters. So that's why we don't like to sort of slam stuff into limiters. It just doesn't sound good. And I think there's a general kind of groundswell of opinion that is now not the way to mix and master music. So during the kind of mid to late 80s into the sort of 90s and 2000s, there was a growing groundswell of dissatisfaction with the fact that stuff was being mastered like this and they're not sounding good, and also that things like TV adverts were much louder in the program. You have to keep reaching for the remote and turning them down. So various sort of companies and organisations got involved and wrote a series of papers, mainly in the mid to late 2000s, to try and come up with some standards or ways of measuring loudness that would work basically, and get away from this kind of loudness war type approach. And that's where loudness units full scale came from. And those LUFS levels have been adopted by streaming platforms. So, for example, Spotify has a maximum LUFS averaged over a track of -14. YouTube is the same, and I think Apple is -16. Broadcast standard is something like -23, so pretty low down. Some platforms will turn up stuff that's below that. Most platforms, if it's above -14, LUFS will turn it down, will reduce the volume down, which isn't so much a problem if you've mixed it properly, but how we decided to approach it is that we want to use that top level of -14 as our kind of guide, rather than the target. Really, it's not worth mixing to a LUFS target and pitch it towards that level rather than a lower level, because turning it down is less likely to affect the quality of audio than turning it up. See, when you have a waveform like this, and say that was running at -16, and Spotify, for example, turned it up to -14, then some of these peaks might go into the red, and would be caught by the Spotify limiter and in effect chopped off. So it's probably better to have your stuff turned down than it is turned up. Not all platforms will turn it up. I don't think YouTube does, but that's worth bearing in mind. So what do we use? How do we approach it? Well, there's a couple of tools that we really like using. One is Waves WLM meter. Now, good old Cubase does have a loudness meter, and it's very good, and it works. But we wanted something we could port from Cubase into things like Wavelab Elements, which doesn't have its own loudness meter, and also it's a bit more flexible because you can kind of move around from screen to screen. And I just like the way it kind of summarizes stuff. So the other thing we use is Waves L3 limiter, and we just set it flat. Here it's just an out CD of -1.2, a threshold of -1.5 to give the limiter time to sort of apply the limit. Why -1.2? Well, the other part of loudness standards that a lot of streaming services are adopting is this maximum true peak. And if you've got a true peak meter, and WLM has a true peak meter in it, it's a much more accurate measure of your true peak levels, and that will tell you if you're pushing over that. So most platforms have an upper limit of -1.0 dB true peak, and that's the thing you don't want to exceed. You want to keep under that. So that true peak level there is what we try and sort of adhere to and get it to stay below 1.0. So the limiter is set to -1.2 because even though it's set to -1.2, you will still get stuff straying through at -1, even 0.9 sometimes. So it's important to have the limiter a bit below that so that the true peaks don't get through. The other thing we use is this brilliant Nugent visualizer, and that's mainly for things like the frequency spread and any phasing issues. Just generally check the quality of the mix. But WLM and L3 are our go-tos. Another useful thing in setting your limits is groups. So what we usually do on a mix is we set the stereo out to 0, and I don't move that. That stays 0. I never change that. And to control the volume using groups. So these are all kind of summing groups or sub-mixes from electric guitars, acoustic guitars. You can have as many as you like. You can have one for lead guitar, one for rhythm guitar, one for vocals, one for you can just go mad if you want. So we use those as a kind of sub-mix to control the volume going into the master out. You'll notice here there's also a mix and a sends subgroup. So all the mix channels go into there from the groups, and then the effect sends go into them. That's just so I can see how each part, the mix and the sends, is contributing to the mix. It's just something that a habit I've got into. It's not essential, but we find it useful. But certainly the groups help, because then if you're coming in too hot on the meters, you can just reduce the volumes overall. Now Cubase there's a very useful function of linking the channels. You can do any channel in a group. So I've got all these linked in as a group channel group. And once you've got the mix balance set and the kind of, mix how you want it, then you can link these together and group them, and then turn them up and down at the same time. Now, obviously, the more you turn it up, the more you turn it down, that balance might not be maintained, but it's a very good, useful way of just adjust small adjustments in your mix volume without having to, turn everything down and lose that overall balance. Like I say, you might have to do some tweaking depending on how much you turn it up and down and how much things are coming out or disappearing. But generally speaking, it's a very useful thing. And I would recommend that if you're wanting to control your mix going into the stereo bus, then subgrouping is a very good way of doing it, a very easy way of doing it. So going back to our celestial reflections. So celestial reflections, the measurements from it on the WLM came out as almost spot on -14, a dynamic range of 12 LU, which is big, it's a lot. Most tracks have a range of sort of 5 or 6 on average. So it's a very dynamic track, which is why we used it to sort of test some of these processes. And the true peak is spot on at -1.0. And like I say, the -14 is a guide. You don't have to adhere to it religiously. I think the key thing is not going over the -1.0 to give yourself some headroom. The other reason for that headroom is because when you convert from a high-res format like WAV down to something like MP3, then that will usually introduce some higher peaks. So if you set that to -1.0, then you might get the peaks on a converted file going to -0.8 or 0.7. You can lose, 0.3, 0.4, even more. The lower res you convert it, the bigger those peaks tend to go. So that's why the headroom is there. That's why the streaming service have it, because when they convert, and they all do usually convert, most of them, into a lossy format, you want some headroom to absorb those higher peaks that are created. So that's how we approach our kind of mixing and mastering for streaming. Not everyone has the same approach, but that's how we do it, and it works. There's a really good article by Sound on Sound magazine, which we'll post a link to below, and there's a lot of differing opinions and approaches out there. So I think you have to kind of pick your own and kind of pitch yourself where you think is the best place to be. That's kind of all from us. We'd love to hear your comments and your ways of approaching this, and your experiences of dealing with LUFS and loudness. And thanks for watching, and see you next time. Sorry, dude.